The assembly rooms at Harrogate were full and warm and lit with more candles than Frances Mallory had seen burning in one room in the better part of 2 years. She did not count them. She had learned some time ago that counting beautiful things only clarified how few of them belonged to her. She counted the panes in the far window instead, 11, with one cracked in the lower corner. She stood where she was meant to stand, behind Lady Marchfield's left shoulder, which was where she had stood for the better part of 3 hours, and she watched. The room smelled of beeswax and powder and the warmth of close bodies, and the musicians were pausing between sets, so the noise had shifted to the sound of 200 people filling a silence with conversation at once. The candlelight turned the gowns of the ladies nearest Frances to gold. She was wearing grey. When the master of ceremonies began to move, she felt the change before she identified it. Not a sound. Not a signal. Simply the alteration in the room's pattern that a woman who has attended many such evenings as an observer, never as a guest, learns over time to read. He was threading his way across the floor with the purposefulness of a man fulfilling a function. Behind him, slightly to his left, came Mr. Fenwick. Frances had 4 seconds. She had worked this out beforehand, the way she worked household accounts, column by column, without sentiment, until the figure at the bottom was clear. Lady Marchfield owed Mr. Fenwick a debt. Frances had heard this through a study door that no one had thought to close around the help, because the help was not the sort of person whose presence required accounting for. The debt was not one that could be discharged with money. Frances had understood, by the time she stood in this bright room with Mr. Fenwick 6 paces away and closing, what kind of settlement she was meant to be. 3 seconds. The room was warm. A woman might feel the air grow close after 3 hours on her feet. Any gentlewoman with feeling nerves might find that a crowded assembly, late in the evening, was more than she could well endure. Frances let her knees give. She had planned it carefully. Slow, sideways, a collapse that spoke of delicacy rather than alarm, that would give a room full of people something to attend to, that was not the introduction she was not going to permit. She had planned for the small gasp from the nearest onlookers, which came. She had planned for Lady Marchfield's intake of breath behind her, which also came. She had not planned for the arms. 2 hands caught her before she reached the floor, one at her back and one beneath her arm, and they took her weight without fumbling, without anything at all except the quiet precision of someone who had seen this coming before it arrived. Then a voice said, very near her ear, "Nice try." She went still. She was still in his arms, which had not loosened. She was aware of the warmth of them through the thin fabric of her gown, and of the fact that she had planned to be on the floor by now, safely insensible, and instead she was entirely upright, held by a man who had just informed her that he knew. She had been ready for concern, for the useful chaos of a woman in distress, for the moment to close like water over the aborted introduction and leave nothing behind it. She had not been ready for someone who knew. It was dry, that voice. It was not unkind. It had the patience of a man who has seen a thing enough times to no longer be surprised by it, while remaining, in some specific and unhurried way, curious about the particular performer he had just caught. It was not the voice of a man who had been fooled. She did not open her eyes. She heard the crowd pressing closer, the murmur of concern spreading outward, and the particular rustle of a room that has found something more interesting to look at than what it was looking at before. She heard Lady Marchfield's voice, composing itself into the correct shape of distress. She heard the master of ceremonies making the small sounds of a man whose function had been overtaken by events. She heard Mr. Fenwick say nothing at all. The introduction was gone. Once broken, it would not come back. She knew this as a settled fact, the way she knew a sum that did not balance could not be made to balance by wanting it to. He was carrying her toward the anteroom. The crowd was falling away behind them. Her reticule slipped from her wrist as he moved, and the vinaigrette inside it struck the floor, the small sound of the little bottle with its perforated top, and she did not reach for it. She was not ready to open her eyes. She was not entirely sure she would be, for some time yet. She did not know what any of it meant. She knew only that he had not put her down. The anteroom held 4 chairs, a small sofa, and considerably less candlelight than the ballroom she had just left. Frances sat in the chair nearest the door on the principle that being nearest the door was never a disadvantage, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she did not look at the man standing on the other side of the room. He had set her down without ceremony, not roughly, with the efficiency of a man performing a function and not requiring recognition for it. He had stepped back. He had said nothing further, and the nothing was, she was discovering, louder than the something had been. She counted the legs of the sofa. 4, as expected. She counted the paintings on the wall. 2, neither memorable. She did not count the man. There was a sound, faint, somewhere on the floor behind her. He had bent and picked it up before she understood what had happened. He crossed the room and held it out. The vinaigrette. She took it. Their fingers did not touch. He stood for a moment before stepping back, and he said, "The scent is very faint. For something one keeps for emergencies." She looked up then, because there was nothing else to do. "I find the air in most assembly rooms quite adequate," she said. "As do I," he said. This was as close as either of them came to it, and they both understood that it was close enough. She closed her hand around the vinaigrette. He returned to his position across the room. The sound from the ballroom pressed at the closed door, but did not enter. He said, after a pause that was precisely long enough to be deliberate, "I will see you home. The crowd will expect it." She understood the construction of this sentence. He was not asking. He was not, precisely, commanding. He was explaining to her the social mechanics of what had already been decided by the moment he caught her, in the same dry register as everything else he had said. She could refuse. She could create a scene. She could announce herself well and recovered and require no escort. She was also the only person in the building who knew what this man knew, and making a scene required a witness whose interest in the matter was at least partly neutral. "As you say," she said. The door opened. Lady Marchfield entered, wearing precisely the degree of distress the situation required, and no more. Her eyes went to the Duke first, not to Frances, and her whole face underwent a small readjustment, the way a room readjusts when a fire is lit in it, except in the opposite direction. "Your Grace," she said. He inclined his head. He said he trusted Miss Mallory was recovered. Lady Marchfield said she had been most concerned. He said he was certain she had. Lady Marchfield said that, naturally, she would take Miss Mallory home at once, and he said that he had already offered to escort her, and the silence that followed this was the most articulate silence Frances had ever been in the centre of. Lady Marchfield could not contradict a duke, not without explaining why, in front of witnesses, which would require explaining a great many other things besides. "Of course," Lady Marchfield said. Her voice was smooth and entirely without expression. Frances picked up her reticule from the arm of the chair. She did not look at Lady Marchfield's face. The Duke's carriage was better than she had ridden in. She was aware of this in the manner of someone cataloguing facts rather than experiencing them. She sat against the far side. He sat against the near side. Between them was the appropriate distance. Through the window, the streets of Harrogate moved past in the dark and were gone. He said, as they turned into the road that led to Lady Marchfield's townhouse, "I will call tomorrow." It was not a question. It was not, precisely, a statement. It landed somewhere between the two, in the same space as everything else he had said tonight. She did not say yes. She did not say no. "I will be at home," she said. The carriage turned. The darkness outside the window shifted. "I know," he said. He came to call at 11, which was, Lady Marchfield said, very attentive of him. Frances stood at the window of the Cavendish Street sitting-room and watched the square below, while Lady Marchfield arranged herself on the settee. The London morning light came in at an angle that made everything look slightly more expensive than it was. She had noticed this the first week she arrived. She counted the panes of the sitting-room window while the Duke was shown in, 8 with the latch on the third one rusted shut. He entered without apparent interest in the room's arrangement and took the chair that Lady Marchfield had not specifically designated for him, which was the chair with a direct view of both doors. He accepted a cup of tea from the footman and did not drink it. Across the room, the Duke set the cup aside, and Frances, at her window, was aware that he was not drinking it. He had been performing this call since he was 22, across 16 seasons, beginning when Parliament assembled and ending when it rose into the summer. He had accepted cups of tea in rooms precisely like this one, from women precisely like Lady Marchfield, and the thing he had learned was that such rooms always contained an arrangement. The furniture, the light, the conversation, all of it placed. He had learned this through an error. 7 years ago. A woman in a Mayfair garden who had fallen so convincingly that he had knelt beside her for a quarter of an hour, genuinely alarmed, and had held her hands while the servants were summoned, and by the time he understood that nothing had been genuinely wrong, he had already committed himself to a letter he could not honestly unsend. The extraction had cost him 6 months, and a friendship he had valued more than he had understood until it was gone. He had watched for the tells since then. The controlled fall. Not the sideways drop of a body that cannot help itself, but the careful calibration of a body choosing its angle. The timing, always too convenient. The closed hand, around whatever small object had been selected for the occasion, that did not open even in distress, because the distress was not quite real enough to make the hand forget its purpose. He had seen all of them last night, and more clearly than he had in any of the previous cases. He had not, for that reason, put her down. Lady Marchfield was called from the room at 11:30 by a footman with an urgent message. Whether the urgency was genuine or manufactured, Frances could not determine. She turned from the window. The Duke was already looking at her. She said, "I am a companion. £22 a year plus my board. The reference that makes that position possible is in Lady Marchfield's keeping, and she will not give it to me independently of her goodwill." She had decided, in the 24 hours since the ball, that the shortest account was the most useful. He had half the information already. She was completing the sum. Lady Marchfield owes Mr. Fenwick a debt she cannot settle with money. I am the settlement. Once I am married, everything I possess passes immediately to my husband by law. Her debt is discharged. He has what he came to the assembly to collect. And I have no recourse, because I would no longer be a person the law recognizes as having any. She watched him hear this. He did not shift in the chair or alter the angle of his expression. He was listening the way a man listens, who is already deciding what the information costs. The feint was the only tool I had, she said. He was quiet. He was, she had already observed, not the kind of man who spoke while he was still thinking. What do you intend to do next? He said. Not. What would you like me to do? What do you intend? The difference was not a small one. She did not have an answer. She had not had one since the previous night, and the figures had not resolved to anything she could act on without more information than she currently possessed. Before she could speak, the door opened. Lady Marchfield returned with her composure fully reinstated. The Duke rose. He addressed Lady Marchfield with the appropriate forms. He said the morning had been most pleasant. He took his hat and gloves from the footman. At the door, he turned and said, with the correct degree of nothing in his voice, "Good day, Miss Mallory." Nothing in this exchange would have alarmed a witness. Everything in it had already changed the ground they were standing on. The pretext was a letter that required Lady Marchfield's immediate attention, and could not. The Duke's man had said, "Wait." Lady Marchfield went. Francis was shown to the Duke's library to wait for the business to conclude, and the door was left, appropriately, open. She did not sit down immediately. The library was a better room than any she had been given to wait in, and she was aware of this in the way she was aware of most things she was not entitled to, as a fact, useful, not requiring any particular feeling attached to it. She walked to the window first. She counted the shelves, 22, floor to ceiling on the interior wall, with a gap at the second from the left, where a set of volumes had been removed and not replaced. The room smelled of leather and cold ash, and the particular density of a great many books that had not been opened recently. She sat at the desk, because it was where the chair was. The household documents were there because someone had left them there, not for her, not with any intention she was part of. A steward's account book, open to a page near the back. She saw it the way she saw columns of any kind, not by looking, but by the column resolving itself into a sum that did not match the sum below it. She looked at the number. She looked at the entry 2 lines above it. The figure appeared twice. Once as a purchase of lamp oil in September. Once as a purchase of lamp oil in September. A different line, the same amount, the same merchant's name. The second entry sat 3 lines down from the first, in a hand that was otherwise identical, but had formed the initial letter slightly differently. Someone had copied and forgotten they had already copied. One of them was a duplicate. There was, as a result, nearly £3 sitting in the account that ought not to be there, which meant £3 not sitting somewhere it should. She found a blank slip of paper on the desk. She wrote out the 2 entries, the correct sum and the discrepancy. She placed it beside the account book. She took the vinaigrette from her reticule and set it on the desk beside the paper, because she was thinking, and her hands needed to be empty to think. She did not particularly notice she had done it. The Duke returned 20 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway for a moment that was long enough to register. She had not expected him to stop. She turned the slip of paper toward him and said, "There is a discrepancy in your steward's accounts. Lamp oil, September. The same transaction entered twice, nearly £3. He came forward. He looked at what she had written, and then at the account book. He said nothing for a moment, and then he rang the bell. The steward arrived promptly, and looked at the figures with the expression of a man who has been asked to confirm something he would sincerely prefer not to confirm. He examined both entries. He confirmed it. She was correct. He left looking somewhat smaller than he had entered. After the door closed, the Duke stood for a moment longer at the desk. He was looking at the account book, or possibly at the slip of paper, or possibly at the vinaigrette sitting on his desk that had not been there when he left the room. He was not looking at any of these things with admiration. He was looking at them with attention, which was a different thing entirely, and which she had, she realized, encountered less often than she had understood until this moment. "Thank you," he said. "I was bored," she said. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, and that she thought he had decided against, quickly and on purpose. He looked at the vinaigrette once more. He did not pick it up. He did not say anything about it. She picked it up and put it back in her reticule. She had been in his library for the better part of an hour. She had found an error in his accounts, and he had looked at her with attention, and she had no clear idea what to do with either of those facts, so she filed them away in the same manner she filed the vinaigrette, and she waited for the carriage to be brought round. The morning gathering at Mrs. Ashworth's rooms in Brook Street had perhaps a dozen women in it when Lady Marchfield arrived, which was precisely the number required for a thing said in that room to be said in effect to the neighbourhood. Frances stood at the appropriate distance behind Lady Marchfield's shoulder, accepted a cup of tea she did not drink, and counted the rose pattern on the carpet. 11 blooms visible from where she stood, plus a partial 12th at the edge of the hearthrug. The Duke of Harlow was near the window with one of Mrs. Ashworth's other guests, a glass in his hand that he was not drinking from, which Frances had come to recognize as his habitual way of being in a room without being consumed by it. She counted 12 blooms. She had been wrong about the partial one. Lady Marchfield's move, when it came, was beautifully executed. She accepted a second cup of tea, waited until the conversation had found a natural pause, and said, with a small, fond sigh, that she did so worry about Frances. "She is a dear girl," she said. "I could not speak more warmly of her. But she is perhaps not entirely sensible of how certain situations might present themselves to an outside observer. She is so very eager to be of service, and so very attentive to those above her station, that I have sometimes found myself wondering whether she fully understands what such attention can imply." She did not say the Duke's name. She did not need to. His position near the window was visible to everyone in the room, and the brief pause after those above her station was placed with considerable artistry. Frances set her teacup on the nearest flat surface, and did not say anything. The room waited for the Duke. He was looking at something through the window. He did not turn around. He did not say anything. The pause extended. Lady Marchfield received 2 murmured expressions of sympathy from the ladies nearest her. The conversation resumed, carefully, around a different subject. Frances crossed to the chair where Lady Marchfield's shawl had been placed. She picked it up and said, in the voice she had spent years making unremarkable, "I believe it is time we returned home, my lady. You mentioned the cold." Lady Marchfield hadn't mentioned the cold. She had never mentioned the cold in Frances's hearing, not once in 11 months. But she accepted the shawl with the expression of a woman whose concern for her companion has been, once again, rewarded with loyalty, and she made her farewells. Frances did not look at the Duke on the way out. She did not permit herself the expense. In the room Lady Marchfield kept for her on the 3rd floor of the Cavendish Street house, Frances stood at the window after they returned, and was not calm. She had no expectation of being calm. She had learned, however, that the way she managed not being calm was the same way she managed most things that needed managing, by counting. The window gave onto the back garden. She counted the panes. 9. She counted the steps on the staircase from the landing to the floor below. 14, with the 3rd one from the bottom that creaked if you put your weight on the left side. She counted the number of times she had heard Lady Marchfield use that particular tone of fond concern in the presence of other people. today was the second. The first had been at the Pendleton dinner, a month ago, over the question of whether Francis had lingered too long in conversation with the Pendleton son. She had not lingered. She had been trapped by his inability to conclude a sentence. It helped, not immediately, and not entirely. But by the fourth count, the anger had become something she could fold and set aside, rather than something with edges. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend. Lady Marchfield sent for her at 7 o'clock to inform her that Mr. Fenwick had inquired after her health. He had expressed it, Lady Marchfield said, with great solicitousness. He had asked whether Miss Mallory intended to attend the Forsyth Assembly next Thursday. Lady Marchfield said this in the tone of a woman delivering good news. Francis did not reply. The letter arrived on Tuesday, addressed to Lady Marchfield's house, but intended for Francis, which she understood from the absence of any name on the outer fold, and the fact that it had been placed directly into her hands by a footman who met her on the stair rather than brought to the hall table with the rest of the morning post. She read it once, put it in her reticule, and went for a walk in Green Park at 2 o'clock. He was already there when she arrived, standing on the gravel path near the row of limes with his hands clasped behind him, looking at the middle distance in the manner of a man who has not been waiting and has not been watching the gate. He had, she suspected, been waiting and watching since 1:30. She fell into step beside him. A groom of his was visible at the far end of the path, examining the distance with equal interest. "You want to explain," she said. "I want to explain," he said. She nodded and waited, and they walked, and he did. "Any word from me on your behalf, in that room, in front of those people, requires me to say how I know what I know about you." He did not look at her while he spoke. He looked at the path ahead in the manner of a man who has thought this through carefully enough to say it without assistance. "And what I know about you," said aloud to that audience, "is not a defense. It is a new problem." She walked in silence for a moment. She had known this. She had worked it out herself in the 14 steps between the hearthrug at Mrs. Ashworth's and the front door on the way out. She had known it abstractly, as she knew most things that were going to cost her before they arrived. What she had not known was that someone else had worked it out too. "You thought through the whole chain," she said. "I did. Before you said nothing. Before I said nothing." She looked at the limes. The park was thinly occupied at this hour, and the quality of the quiet was the kind she had learned to be grateful for. She found a bench near the edge of the path and sat down because she needed a moment that was not in motion. He sat at the appropriate distance. Between them, the bench was empty. She took the vinaigrette from her reticule. She set it on the bench between them. She did not explain this. She was not sure she could have explained it. It was simply the thing she had in her hand that she had the most reason to put down. He looked at it for a long moment. "I would not have caught you," he said, "if I had intended to let you fall." She understood this. It was not a declaration. It was something more specific than a declaration. It was an account. He was telling her that what he had done in the ballroom had been considered, as everything he did appeared to be considered, and that the consideration had come down on her side. She had been told reassuring things by men before. This was the first time one of them had offered her a line of reasoning she could check. Something changed in her that had not changed in a long time, and she did not name it. She had learned that naming a thing too early was a way of frightening it off. She knew only that it was the particular strangeness of having one's reasoning taken seriously by another person, and that she had encountered it less often than she had understood until now. She picked up the vinaigrette and put it back in her reticule. They walked as far as the end of the lime path and turned in opposite directions. When she returned to Cavendish Street, Lady Marchfield informed her that she had accepted a dinner invitation for them both. The Forsyth House. Next Thursday. Mr. Fenwick, she said, would be among the guests. The Forsyth dinner was the occasion Mr. Fenwick had apparently decided to treat as the end of the preliminary phase. He made this clear within the first quarter of an hour of the drawing-room gathering, when he addressed Frances as, "My dear Miss Mallory," and took the chair beside her with the ease of a man settling into furniture that already belongs to him. Lady Marchfield, across the room, watched with an expression that was exactly equidistant between pride and relief. Frances thanked him for his inquiry after her health and moved to the far end of the sofa, which was as far as the sofa allowed without standing up. She had spent 3 days finding the document. She had found it on the 4th in a note of hand copied by the Duke's secretary from a record held by Mr. Fenwick's own principal creditor, which suggested that Mr. Fenwick's financial position was considerably less settled than the confidence with which he had taken that chair. The note of hand was for £300. It bore Lady Marchfield's signature. It was dated 14 months ago. The document was in her reticule. She waited until Mrs. Hale, the Forsyths' nearest neighbour and the sharpest-eyed person in the drawing-room, came within conversational range. Mrs. Hale was perhaps 60, with the alert quality of a woman who has been reading rooms professionally since before Frances was born. "Mrs. Hale," Frances said, "may I ask your opinion on a legal matter? You understand these things better than I do." Mrs. Hale said she would do her best. Frances took the note of hand from her reticule, unfolded it, and held it out. "What does this represent, would you say?" Mrs. Hale took it. She read it. The reading took perhaps 12 seconds. Several people in the drawing-room had stopped, without quite knowing why, drawn by the quality of a very controlled silence that had established itself near the fireplace. "It appears to be a note of hand," Mrs. Hale said. "A private debt. £300, dated—" She looked at the signature. Something in the quality of her stillness altered. 14 months ago. "Thank you," Frances said. She took the document back, refolded it, and put it in her reticule. She said nothing further. She did not look at Mr. Fenwick. She did not look at Lady Marchfield. Mr. Fenwick stood. He said something about having remembered a prior engagement. He left with more speed than the occasion permitted, and the door settled behind him. Lady Marchfield remained. She had no choice. Leaving immediately after Fenwick would have been its own commentary, and she was a woman who had spent 30 years avoiding commentaries she had not written herself. She sat for 40 minutes in a room where Mrs. Hale was in animated and thoroughly audible conversation with Mrs. Forsyth, and she said nothing that she had intended to say tonight. Frances counted the minutes without appearing to count them. In the carriage home, Lady Marchfield said nothing for the first quarter of an hour, which was, in Frances's 11 months of service, a record. In the second quarter, she said that Frances had made a very serious error of judgment. "Yes, my lady," Frances said. This was not, on the available evidence, the response Lady Marchfield had been preparing for. At Cavendish Street, Frances went upstairs in the dark. She counted the steps. 14, with the third from the bottom that creaked on the left side. There were 14 going down as well, but they were not the same 14. Coming up in the dark, with the quiet of the house around her, and the knowledge of what had happened settling into its proper weight, the 14 steps felt like a different number entirely. She had won something tonight. A small and specific something. A room's attention, a man's retreat, 40 minutes of Lady Marchfield sitting among witnesses and unable to say the true thing. It was not a large victory. It was a documented one, and documentation was the kind that held. She knew it was not over. But she counted the 14 stairs in the dark and permitted herself, briefly, the arithmetic of what she had done. Lady Marchfield dismissed her at 9 o'clock in the morning, without a reference, with a quarter's salary in lieu of notice, and the suggestion that she might benefit from reflecting on the consequences of overstepping. Frances packed her trunk, which did not take long, because she had learned never to accumulate more than she could carry, and she sat on the end of the bed in the room on the 3rd floor of the Cavendish Street house and counted the panes of the window. 9, with the latch still rusted on the 3rd one. The letter from the Dowager Duchess of Harlow was already in her reticule. It had arrived the day before yesterday, which meant the Duke had anticipated this outcome, or had made certain of it. Frances had not yet decided how she felt about that. She had decided to accept the position. She accepted the position. Harlow Court was 3 hours east of London, by good road, and it was large in the way that only certain houses were large. Not imposingly, not ornately, but in the way that suggested whoever had built it had never needed to impress anyone with the building itself. The grounds were orderly. The house was orderly. Every visible surface was correct and properly maintained, and the whole of it had the quality of a well-managed room in which no one had laughed in some time. The Dowager Duchess of Harlow received her in the front sitting-room standing up, which Frances thought was either a mark of respect or a demonstration that she still could. "I am 73, the Dowager Duchess said, "and I have had 3 companions in 4 years, none of whom lasted, and 2 of whom wept. I have no patience for weeping, and no use for someone who is going to be afraid of me. Are you afraid of me?" Frances said she did not think so, but that she would let the Dowager Duchess know if that changed. There was a pause. Something in the Dowager Duchess's expression shifted toward satisfaction. She sat down and said Frances might as well sit too. The Duke was not in the room. He was in the house, visible that afternoon, crossing the corridor between the library and the steward's office. But he did not seek her out, and she did not seek him out, and they were both, she thought, sensible enough to understand that the arrangement required a deliberate distance that would take some time to calibrate. The household staff were cautious with her for the first 3 days. On the 4th, she found the household accounts on the morning room table, left there from the housekeeper's weekly review, and she said, without looking up from them, that the kitchen was ordering saltfish from 2 different suppliers at 2 different prices, and that ordering consistently from the cheaper one would save approximately 6 shillings a week. The housekeeper, whose name was Mrs. Rowe, said she would consider it. On the 6th day, she quietly changed the supplier. On the evening of the 4th day, Frances went to her room. Her own room, with her trunk in the corner and the key in the lock, and no requirement that she ask permission before closing the door. She took the vinaigrette from her reticule and set it on the dressing table. It was not a large table. The surface was entirely hers. She looked at the vinaigrette sitting there in the last of the evening light and found she could not immediately account for what she was feeling, which was unusual. She was generally good at accounts. She counted the panes of the window. 6, the smallest number she had counted in some time. She did not know if that meant anything. She left the vinaigrette where it was. She went to sleep with the door closed and the key in the lock, and the house was quiet around her in a way that did not feel, for once, like the quiet of a place where she did not belong. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and the Dowager Duchess read it twice. It was a clear morning at Harlow Court, the kind that made the grounds look deliberate in the best possible way, and Frances was in the garden sorting the morning's correspondence when the footman came to find her. She had been at the estate for 3 weeks and had begun to learn its particular sounds, the creak of the gate to the kitchen garden, the way sound carried differently from the south lawn than from the north. She was summoned before she heard anything she did not yet recognize. She came to the Dowager Duchess's sitting room to find her at the window with the letter still in her hand. In 3 weeks, Frances had seen the Dowager Duchess impatient, dry, occasionally theatrical about her various ailments, and once genuinely amused by a mishap involving a terrier and the drawing-room curtains. She had not seen her look like this. "Sit down," the Dowager Duchess said. She held out the letter. Frances sat. She read it. The letter was from Lady Pendleton, a woman of established social standing and an equally established appetite for information of use. She wrote that she thought the Dowager Duchess should know, as a matter of concern for all parties, that a certain conversation was circulating in the better drawing-rooms of London regarding Miss Mallory's position at Harlow Court, and the particular nature of the Duke's interest in maintaining it. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. The implication was clear by the second sentence of the first. Frances set it on the table. She looked at the window. She didn't cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency she could not afford to spend. "Does your son know yet?" she asked. "He will shortly," the Dowager Duchess said. She sat down across from Frances, with the particular care of a woman who has learned to move deliberately when she is angry enough to want to move fast. "I want you to understand something. I am not angry at you. I am angry at the woman who has done this, and at the situation my son has allowed to develop without resolving it, which he should have resolved before it became your problem to carry." She said this with the precision of someone who has spent 73 years deciding when to say the true thing and has long since stopped seeing any reason not to. He is a careful man. Careful men are sometimes careful at the wrong time. "What are his options?" Frances asked. "He can ask you to leave, dismiss you from the household. The rumor would settle eventually. You would have lost your position twice in a month, the second time from a more visible address, and I would give you the best reference I can write, which is very good indeed. But references do not recover a reputation that has been named in a particular way. Or," Frances said, "or he can marry you, which ends the scandal, which he has not, to my knowledge, asked you, and which is not the same thing as offering a solution and offering a desire." The Dowager Duchess's voice was level and entirely without softening. "I have watched my son do a great many careful, considered things in the past several years. This is the one area where his consideration has come at a cost to someone who did not agree to pay it." Frances was quiet for a long time. The window showed the park in the afternoon light, the far field going gold in a way that was entirely indifferent to what was happening in this room. She understood the shape of the choice the Duke faced. She also understood, in the way she understood columns that did not balance, that both options, as they currently stood, produced the wrong sum. Either move made, without asking her first, repeated what had been done to her in London. A decision made about her, for someone else's convenience, by a man who believed he knew the most efficient answer. She did not know yet whether he understood this. "May I think?" she asked. "You may," the Dowager Duchess said. "You have until this evening." Frances went to her room. She stood at her dressing table and looked at the vinaigrette where she had placed it in the first week she arrived. The small bottle with its perforated top, which had once been the only tool she had. She picked it up, put it in her hand, and closed her fingers around it. She did not yet know what she intended to say. She went to find the Duke. She found him in the library. The room smelled of leather and cold ash and old paper, exactly as it had on the afternoon she first sat at the desk and found the column that did not sum correctly. The evening light came through the windows at the same low angle it had come through then. He was standing at the window with his hands at his sides, and when she entered, he turned, and he looked the way he looked when he had come to the end of his thinking, and was ready to say what he found there. The household was in the corridor. She had passed Mrs. Rowe and 2 footmen on her way in. The library door stood between them and whatever came next. The vinaigrette was in her hand. She had not consciously decided to take it from her pocket. She had simply arrived with it already there. He looked at it. He did not say anything about it yet. He said, "You fell in the Harrogate Assembly Rooms, and managed it better than any performance I have witnessed in 16 seasons, with the exception of one tell. Your hand didn't open around the vinaigrette. I carried that observation with me, and I did not know then what to do with it. Then you found an error in my steward's accounts by accident, and named it without apology, and thanked me by saying you had been bored. Then you stood in a drawing-room in front of a dozen witnesses with a piece of paper and dismantled a scheme that had been running against you for 14 months without raising your voice or injuring anyone beyond what the situation strictly required." He paused. "And you did all of this on £22 a year and board, which is, in my accounting, a remarkable rate of return." He was looking at her the way he looked at very few things, with the full and unhurried weight of his attention, with nothing held back from it, and nothing managed. "I have been watching you since the ballroom. I do not intend to stop." She listened to this. She let it arrive in the order it had been given to her, carefully, without hurrying what it meant. "I will not be a convenient solution to a scandal," she said. "I have been close enough to that position to know exactly what it costs. I will not enter a marriage that functions the way this past year has functioned, where someone else makes an accounting of my worth and arranges the outcome accordingly and considers it generosity that I was informed at all. No," he said, "I am not refusing." "I know you are not." She looked at him. He was standing very still, in the way of a man who has practiced not revealing what he intends, and has now, quietly, abandoned the practice. "What are you offering?" she said. "The same ground you have been fighting to stand on since the ballroom," he said. "I am not solving a problem. I am telling you what I have observed, and I am asking you to believe that I observed it accurately, and I am asking whether you will marry me, not informing you that you should." He paused once, very precisely. "You named what you needed. Those are the terms." She understood this. It was not a performance. It was an accounting, the same kind he had been offering her since the anteroom in Harrogate, the same dry and considered precision applied to the same subject since the beginning, the same quality of a man who has carried a thing long enough to know its actual weight and does not reach for a comfortable rounding of figures when the exact sum is available. It was the kind of thing a man said when he had thought it to the end and found that the end was the same as where he began. "Yes," she said, and she set the vinaigrette on the library table between them, the small bottle with its perforated top that had fallen to the floor of the Harrogate Assembly Rooms and been held in a quiet anteroom and placed on a bench in Green Park and sat on her dressing table at Harlow Court, and she set it between them and left it there. And he looked at it for a long moment, and neither of them picked it up. They were both standing, she realized, on the same side of it. A letter from the Duke's solicitor was dispatched to Lady Marchfield in London 3 days later. Its contents were not recounted to Frances in full, but the Duke read her the one line that mattered. Any further statement made by Lady Marchfield concerning Miss Mallory's character or conduct would be met with legal consequences of a specific and documented kind. Lady Marchfield received the letter. She did not reply. They were married in October, on a morning when the oaks at Harlow Court had gone the particular colour of good leather, in a ceremony so small that the Dowager Duchess afterward declared it the most sensible thing the family had done in 30 years. She said this in front of the vicar, who had conducted the ceremony, and the assembled household staff, who had gathered in the drive in the cold morning air. She said it as if it were a rebuke, which it partly was, and as a compliment, which it also was. Frances had learned by now to recognize both things in the Dowager Duchess's voice at once, and to be grateful for the simplicity of a woman who did not bother to separate them. The house had been changing since before the wedding. The accounts were in order, not only the lamp oil discrepancy from the summer, but 3 further efficiencies that had suggested themselves over the autumn months, each accepted by Mr. Carlyle, the steward, and by Mrs. Rowe separately, in each case, after a period of initial resistance that Frances had learned to factor into her timing. The housekeeper had accepted 2 more suggestions about the kitchen arrangements without Frances asking directly, which was how Frances preferred it. The house sounded different now. There were voices in the corridors at hours when there had not been voices before, and the quality of a well-managed silence had been replaced by the quality of a well-managed noise, which was an entirely different thing and considerably warmer. Lady Marchfield had withdrawn from the social sphere she had occupied. Not to another city, merely to a smaller life in the same city, a reduced household, a narrower circle. She had not repented. She had not written. The silence from her direction was of the kind that comes from a person who has understood, finally, the exact dimensions of what they are dealing with. Mr. Fenwick did not appear at any of the assemblies Frances attended that autumn. She attended them now as the Duchess of Harlow. She counted the first assembly on her fingers in the carriage on the way home, not because she was anxious, but because she had spent 11 months as a companion, and the habit of accounting for herself in small, manageable pieces wasn't a thing that lifted all at once. She noticed she was counting. She stopped. She looked at the dark outside the carriage window instead, and found she did not need to resume. In November she wrote the letter. She addressed it to Miss Penrose, whom she had known briefly at a house in Northumberland 4 years ago, where Miss Penrose had been a governess, and Frances had been passing through on her way to another situation. She had not known her well. She had known her well enough to recognize the look of a woman who had not yet understood that her situation was not permanent, and who needed someone to say so. She did not read back over the letter while she wrote it. She knew only that it began, "I am writing to you because I was in a room not unlike yours. Not very long ago, and no one wrote to me. And I have always thought that someone should have." And that it ended. "You are more than your usefulness to anyone in that house. I thought someone ought to say so in writing, in a letter you can keep and return to." Between the first line and the last, she wrote everything she had once wished to be told. One evening in December, she went to the library to return a book to its shelf. The vinaigrette was still on the table where she had set it in October. She picked it up and stood for a moment with it in her hand, and she found that she had no particular wish to count the panes of the window. She was aware that there were 6 of them. She had not needed to count them to know this, which was a different thing from knowing the number. She put the vinaigrette on the mantelpiece. She did not explain this to anyone. It did not require explanation. It was simply the thing she had in her hand that she no longer had any reason to carry, and the mantelpiece was where things went when they had finished their work and could be seen instead. 2 years after the October wedding, the morning room at Harlow Court had the look of a place that knew what it was for. The windows gave onto the south lawn, where the first frost of autumn had put a gloss on the grass, and from the far side of the grounds came the sounds of the estate going about its work, the carter from the home farm, the distant voices of the tenants mourning. The accounts on the writing table were in order. They were always in order now. The Dowager Duchess was in the chair by the fire with a letter she had received 3 days ago and had not yet finished deciding how to answer, which was her way with anything that deserved a careful reply. She looked up when Francis came in, pronounced the morning entirely satisfactory, and returned to the letter. She had been, Francis had come to understand, waiting for the household to be worth inhabiting. She seemed disinclined to leave. Mrs. Rowe appeared at 10:30 to ask whether the linen order from last week had been approved. Francis had approved it on Tuesday. Mrs. Rowe nodded, said as much, and left. She had not hesitated in the doorway. The Duke came to the morning room at noon with the estate correspondence in one hand and the most recent letter from his solicitor in the other, wearing the expression of a man who has found a figure that does not add up and does not particularly wish to ask why. He handed her the solicitor's letter. She read it. "The Pendleton drainage," she said. "The assessment is wrong. The surveyor has calculated the cost of one system against the scope of another. It is not a complicated error, but someone will need to explain it to the solicitor's office, and it will take slightly longer than it ought." She handed it back. He looked at her for a long moment and permitted himself, finally and without reservation, the smile he had not previously permitted, which changed the whole character of his face, and which she suspected he had been practicing in private long enough to have it ready when it was wanted. "I know," he said. The vinaigrette sat on the mantelpiece in the library, where she had placed it in December of their first year. She had not moved it. She had not touched it in some months, which she knew without counting, because she had not needed to count anything in some months. The vinegar was gone. She was not certain when it had evaporated, only that the bottle was empty the way a tool becomes empty when the work it was made for is finished. She had given it up. She no longer needed a true thing to hold while her body told a lie, because her body had stopped telling them. If you have ever been the woman in the room that everyone moves away from, not out of cruelty, but simply out of the natural drift of people toward the center and away from the edges, you will know what it cost her to stand at that window in Harrogate and decide. If you have ever had a plan fail in the arms of the one person who could see through it, and stayed still anyway, and found that the falling was not as final as you had believed, you will know what it meant when he did not let go. If you have ever been seen, truly and entirely seen, by someone who had no particular reason to look and looked anyway, and then looked again, and kept on looking, you will know why she put the vinaigrette down at last. She had spent a long time counting the things she could not afford to lose. She had not known, until she stopped, how long. If this story found you somewhere quiet tonight, stay a moment by the fire with me. Tell me in the comments which line you would have kept, and whether you have ever had a plan fail in exactly the right moment. I would very much like to hear it. And the next time you find yourself beside a woman who is counting something carefully and quietly to herself, be patient with her. You may not know what she is counting against. Until then,